welcome to week 3 of legal research, and the theme for this week is analysing a legal problem. And this is where we take the work we've done over the first 2 weeks and try and wrap it up and try and actually build the solid foundation of that legal problem that will help us through the rest of the research process. This is something you probably haven't done very much before. It's not something that's necessarily taught in the early part of your studies, but you'll find as the sorts of legal problems you deal with become more complex and larger, then the foundations become even more important, because you don't have that attention to detail at the beginning. You'll find you get to the end and any sort of mistakes become amplified through that process. So the first week we looked at that spaghettiization mind map process where we were just throwing all those ideas around. We were trying to find as many ideas as possible to make sure we'd covered the issue. The next week we really focused on pulling out the core arguments. What are the positions? What are the pros and cons for each? Who holds those different positions, to understand where the field is, because there's no point in trying to persuade people of things that are already well accepted or well believed, or that everyone already believes. We need to find is what is contentious. And this is a mistake many novices, particularly students, make when analysing problems. They say, okay, there's 3 parts to this problem, 2 parts are really easy, so I'm going to really focus on the easy stuff that everyone agrees on. Actually, you're much better off focusing on the things that people disagree on, which look harder, but actually are much more much easier to answer, because you've got some leverage to push back on. You've actually got, an argument, you've got sides, you've got different positions. That's something you can work with. But presenting ideas that everyone believes in, you just end up doing Wikipedia. It's like, here's this, it's what everyone believes. So this week, we're looking at how we can start turning that problem into a solution, how to pull those strands of debate that you identified last week together, and to weave them together into your project. And ultimately what you want, as always, is that post-it note, is that short, concise statement of, this is my problem, this is the argument, and this is the case for these reasons. And then you can then plan out how you're going to examine and explore that project. And that's what the workshop this week is about. So everyone says you do the introduction, the body, and the conclusion, and it's like, yeah, great, that really helps. It doesn't really get you very far. What we're really thinking about is, well, how do you actually structure, once we've got that core argument, how do we structure that into parts, into something that makes sense? That you've got a structure where you've got components of an essay, and you've got links between each of them that are logical and make sense. That at the beginning you say, this is my argument, I'm going to make it in 3 points, and that each thing flows together. Alright, I'm going to come back to that. I just thought I would introduce that. One of the big themes this week is also about writing, and I think we often think of reading and writing as 2 separate activities. I want you to start thinking about these things as activities that are joined together. And when you read, you write. And, when you're writing, you're also continuing to read. And there is actually a complex relationship between these things. It's not a matter of finding out the right answer and then writing it up. And these are things that you only get better by doing. And the more practice you have, and the more you're able to reflect on what you do and get feedback and look over it and build on that iteration, the better you get as a writer. And again, that's one of those myths that I think particularly first year students believe, is it's just a matter of finding the right answer and writing it down. And research is not about that. There's so much more to it. I'm sure the light bulbs have been going on for you for a while now, and you're starting to realise that to mature as a legal professional is not about just finding the right answer. All right. The readings this week, the first reading is a revision reading to remind you some things from first year about legal sources and legal referencing. And I think I've just put it in there for you to have a bit of a scan through and to have a look at, and to reacquaint yourself with some of that introductory material. And I think it's going to be a good opportunity to just pay attention to detail on that. and to remember things you may have forgotten. The second reading is one concerning Iraq, and it's quite a long reading, and I don't recommend you necessarily have to read the whole thing, because one of the things we emphasise in this subject is the importance of being able to skim through documents and find the key parts. But what I wanted to do was actually to start you on that process of building beyond Iraq. Iraq is the training wheels we give you in first year, but they can very soon become very, very confining to students. And I think looking what other people have said that's critical of Iraq is a useful place to start building your own process and saying, well, yeah, that helped me out at the start, but what am I going to do going forward? And this is where you start developing your own style. Now, part of the problem that I and other people have with Iraq is that it's a simplification that is deceptive, that it makes you think that I just have to go through, issue, rule, application, and conclusion, and bang, that's a magic formula. Whereas the application or analysis phase is actually where all the work is. And it's a bit like the introduction, body, and conclusion thing that people tell you that's how you write an essay. And it's like, well, yeah, but the body, how do you go about writing that? And I'll stick a graphic up here, which is, I think, a great analogy from the world of art, where people get used to those art books that say, here's the really basics of what you do, and then finish the piece. And that's my problem with Iraq, is that we don't have enough guidance on how do you apply a rule, how do you analyse or examine it. And that's what we're working on in this subject. We're working on trying to flesh out that part of it. So I know some people, like people with floaties and training wheels, want to hold on to Iraq, and I love Iraq. But honestly, Iraq will hold you back if you don't start thinking in more complex ways, in the ways in which you approach problems. So yeah, and I think the reading is useful to point out that it's not just me, it's not just my opinion. There is a great deal of concern amongst legal educators that students are actually limiting themselves through holding on to something that is not helping them. Helped them in the past, helped you get started, but you need to move beyond that. All right. In navigating the law, this week we look at textbooks and encyclopedias, which is the starting point of most research. Even though there's a certain, I suppose, type of academic who frowns upon the use of textbooks, encyclopedias, particularly not Wikipedia, which is the source of all evil. But that's not true, because most researchers will start with the basics. And as I'm sure you know, with basic textbooks, with encyclopedias, with Wikipedia, you don't take anything for granted, and you use that as a framework to build on. It is the same here. Now, textbooks in law are a good starting point, but one thing to bear in mind very strongly is that a textbook, of course, is only accurate up to the point at which it is published. And there is one old-fashioned, tricky law lecturer thing that can be done, is you set the exam questions on something that has happened since the textbook came out, relying on students doing more than just reading the textbook. Apologies, the cough is still with us. So it's a slightly mean thing to do, but it does happen from time to time. That it checks whether students are actually switched on and are actually keeping engaged with the field, or if they're just relying on the textbook. But as I said, textbooks are a starting point. Legal encyclopedias are a whole field to themselves. They're often very difficult to read, like they're definitely not Wikipedia. And generally what you need to do with legal encyclopedias is use them once you've had your foundation research done and you're pretty much on progress to completing a piece of research. What you'll find is legal encyclopedias are good at being really up to date of those recent things, of those new changes to the Act or new cases that that examiners might like to chuck in at the end of the day to see who's paying attention. Well, legal encyclopedias fill in those gaps, and then as I've talked about them at length in the notes and the videos, but I just think it's worth spending some time coming to terms with legal encyclopedias and learning how to use them, acknowledging that almost no one finds them user-friendly, that they are a pain and they're not written in a way that's very useful, but they are technically very useful in keeping you up to date. So particularly if you're doing something like a moot, what you'd want to do is make sure that you are really check that there hasn't been, in the last month, any new developments in the law that you needed to take into consideration. All right. Now, the workshop this week moves us back into focusing in our problem in depth, and it's the last of these preparatory weeks where we're looking at really getting into the meat of a problem and designing an approach to it. And from next week onward, we're going to be really moving forward into, well, what are the sources that you use? How do you use them? How do different sources apply differently to a problem? What we want to do this week is really focus on, again, using the mind map format, but whereas in the start we used the mind map format just to throw ideas around and to creatively brainstorm, what we want to do now is to use that same kind of visualization to map out the structure of your approach, which in many ways will also structure the process of research that you'll do. So you'll probably, after last week, find that you've got a whole stack of different questions that are potential contenders for your research, but you're not going to be able to cover all of them in a 2,000 word paper. So what you need to do is now make that choice of which one do you think is which question, which debate is going to be at the core of your problem, what are the parts and components of that, how you'll lay those out, and then how you'll provide a spine that runs throughout the paper, or signposts that enable the reader to very, very clearly see where you're going. And a lot of the skill in writing up research work is in that constant communication with the reader. Whether the reader is someone who's marking, or it's a client, or it's the community at large that you're sending your research out into, you need to be able to tell them, look, this is what I'm going to do, and this is how I'm going to do it, and these are the resources and evidence I'm going to draw on. But we need to deal with these in sequence. So the first point I need to make is this. So moving on to point one, the first part of this question is the issue of this. Now I will be using this evidence to prove that this is the case for this particular point. Then I'll move on to the next point. So a lot of what you do as a writer, as a good writer, is making those transitions and connections. It's not just doing a data dump and saying, here's a whole lot of information. It's carefully positioning that information ahead of time and letting the reader know that this is why I'm telling you about this. Here's a whole series of authorities, but I've already primed you to say these are the important things to look at, and now I will describe the evidence, and then I will apply it to the situation and say, well, there's two sides of the debate, this one, and the evidence shows that this is the correct interpretation. Anyway, we'll be doing more of this as we go. As always, these things are a work in progress, and what's important is that we focus at this point on the process itself, rather than just thinking that writing is something that just naturally emerges, that we sit down at the computer and it just flows out of us, because that's not true for anyone. So the focus here is on writing, but is not necessarily the kind of writing that you're accustomed to. It's not sitting down, the first line, first paragraph on a blank page and just writing in a linear way. In the same way that we read in a way that's very strategic, we also write. And there are certain things, and there are videos in the Equilibrium section this week on writing style and how to get started with writing and all those things I think that are very valuable. But I think a lot of writing is about having the right motivation, and also understanding that a lot of what you write isn't going to be great and you're not going to use it at the end of the day. But that's good, because that's all part of the process, and that's how you get better. So, as Yoda says, do or do not, there is no try. The same applies with writing. Instead of sitting in front of the paper, a blank screen, and saying, oh my God, I've got so much of this to do, I'll never get there, whatever. Just start writing stuff. And if you find you've written material that isn't great, that's fine. You can delete it, you can move it, you can repurpose it, you can rewrite it. The worst thing you can do is you can be too scared to delete something you've written because you think, well, it took me an hour to write that, I've wasted that hour. That's not true at all. Because if you write something that's not up to scratch, you're already going through that process, and you're iterating, and you're developing, and you're learning, and you're building something better. It's not wasted time, it's all part of the process. You know, it's a bit like, you know, Leonardo da Vinci thinking he wasted all that time doing sketches and learning anatomy because, you know, he wanted to do the Mona Lisa first thing, the first stage of his process. We all go through processes, and I think it's important for us to be able to talk about reading and writing and research as a series of connected things, and that makes a huge difference on motivation. And a lot of the advice we have on motivation as students really gets back to that one thing of just do something. You know, set yourself a timer. Use the Pomodoro technique. Set yourself a timer. Write for an hour. Write for half an hour. If you're not into it, stop writing. Do something else. Come back to it later. But getting started is usually the hardest part. And you then have that relationship between your plan and what you're writing, so that you know where you're going. You know, you have a plan laid out. It might be a mind map. It might be another format that you use to do it, but you're able to then assess what you're writing against that and go, okay, that needs to change. I need to move that around, but I'll write this section now. And you have that structure clearly in mind. And that's where a lot of people go off the rails when writing assignments or research, is that they lose track of where they are. They don't have that clear picture going forward, and they don't have that clear structure. And you end up with kind of a data dump, and you lose track of that clear argument they need to be making. Anyway, there's obviously more of this in the study guide this week to talk about. One interesting piece of advice I was given as how you get better at writing is to read. I mean, obviously one way to get better at writing is to keep doing it. That's one thing. But also to read very critically the things that are around you. And don't just read law textbooks and law readings. Read material from other disciplines. Read fiction, read poetry, read IKEA instruction manuals, read screenplays, read board game rules. Find out what good, strong writing is in different contexts and learn from that. You know, IKEA construction manuals have strong writing with pictures. How do they do that? How do they actually show you, without using words at all, how to actually put together a piece of IKEA furniture? I think we can learn a lot from that when it comes to normal writing. And we realise that there's this very strong sense of design and communication with the reader that goes on as we write. And again, we're moving further and further away from that initial idea that academic writing or good writing or research or any of those things is finding the right answer and putting it down on the page. And I think in this subject we've got, because we don't have the burden of a whole lot of Priestley 11 material to get through, and that constant, we've got to cover this and we've got to cover this, we've got to cover this. This gives us a space to actually think about these things and to discuss them. So whether in the workshop or on perusal or just in conversations, I think it's important to take the time, not rush through and go, look, let's get through this unit as quickly as possible, but use it as an opportunity to stop and think about, well, how can I be a better writer? How can I actually use these skills to do better across the board, to actually improve all my other grades, not just my grade in legal research? Okay, so I think that's most of what I had to say this week, at least in this introductory format. I look forward to seeing you all in the workshops, but remember always that it's all about just getting in and doing it and practicing and improving. There's no magic solution, but it's something that it will take you a lifetime to learn, it'll take you a short time to learn, but a lifetime to master. And one thing I really enjoy on this subject is actually watching how individuals, the light bulbs go on and people actually improve their process as we go. Anyway, rambling now, so I'll stop this recording and let you get into the rest of your activities for this week.